Hey guys, tonight we ease into a place where the air itself seems determined to push you back inside your blanket. Imagine you've just opened your eyes, and already your tent flaps are slapping like irritated hands. The first light of dawn doesn't so much glow as it filters through a yellow haze of dust. You take a breath and taste grit. Congratulations! You've made it a grand total of 10 seconds in the windy west, and you're already struggling. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me your location and local time. I always love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day doesn't politely start here. It barges in like a rowdy neighbor leaning on the horn at 6 a.m. Your blanket, well, the one you tried to pull snug around your shoulders, flaps open and lets in a chilly breeze that somehow manages to feel both icy and bone dry at the same time. Dust sticks to your lips. You squint, realizing your eyes have crusted over with fine grains that worked their way in overnight. It's a rude awakening, and you've barely set foot outside. Historically, settlers who braved the Great Plains or the West in general weren't exaggerating when they described the wind as a constant companion. Letters from the 19th century almost sing with frustration about never-ending gusts that rattled windows and pulled shingles loose. One pioneer's diary bluntly called it an invisible herd of buffalo charging through the air, which is somehow both poetic and deeply unhelpful when you're trying to get back to sleep. You push yourself upright, and the ground beneath you is littered with last night's attempts at keeping things secure. Pegs pulled from the soil, loose cloth, a cooking pot tipped on its side and filled with sand like some cruel breakfast bowl. You brush grit from your sleeve, only to discover brushing just grinds it in further. Honestly, you look like you've been lightly breaded for frying. Historians still argue whether settlers exaggerated the psychological effects of living in this perpetual draft. Some suggest diaries leaned into melodrama to entertain relatives back east. Others insist the mental toll was real. That constant howling wore at nerves like water dripping on stone. You right now have joined team "This is exhausting." And then there's the sound. It's not a gentle whoosh, it's a roar with no off switch. The wind squeezes through cracks in the boards of your shelter, howls under door frames, and turns each gap into a flute of misery. Modern meteorologists will explain it as sustained winds of 20 to 30 miles an hour, with gusts higher. But to your sleep-deprived brain, it feels like a rock concert for ghosts. The quirky bit. Local lore claims that the wind carried voices, snatches of conversation from neighbors a mile away, or even the whispers of the dead. You can almost believe it when you catch a tone that sounds like your name. It's probably just your own imagination echoing back, but you shiver anyway. Not the fun ghost story kind of shiver either. This is the "why did I come here" variety. You stumble outside. The horizon looks endless, flat as an ironed sheet, yet blurred by airborne dirt. The sun struggles to peek through like it's lost its password. Settlers wrote that sunrises often resembled watercolor paintings smudged by a careless hand. Pretty in theory, but up close, it just means you'll be tasting clay for hours. Your hair is already uncooperative, sticking out like straw in every direction. You could invent an entirely new hairstyle and call it the tumbleweed chic. No amount of water or spit, admit it, you tried, will tame it. And just when you think you've tamed a strand, Another gust undoes all progress. Congratulations, you've become an unwilling pioneer in the world's first wind salon. Joke number 2 arrives when you realize your voice, pitched against the gale, comes back at you half swallowed. You could shout, "Breakfast time," but it would sound more like "bref." At least it's consistent. Your words blow away as quickly as your patience. A serious reality check sets in. If you can't manage the first 10 minutes of daylight without feeling scraped raw, how exactly are you going to last a full day? The pioneers didn't have noise-canceling headphones, double-glazed windows, or weather apps that told them, windy, all day, every day. They simply endured. You, on the other hand, are contemplating whether it's socially acceptable to crawl back into bed and let the 19th century handle itself. And yet, there's a kind of rhythm in the chaos. The constant whoosh almost becomes white noise, like an enormous ocean you can't see. Your heart slows a fraction. You take a long breath, dusty though it is, and feel the day officially begin. The only problem? Everything you planned is already blowing away. The growl of your stomach joins the chorus of the wind. You'd imagined in your optimism a quiet breakfast, maybe a pan of biscuits, maybe even bacon if you were lucky. But here in the windy West, food is just one more contestant in a game called What Will the Breeze Steal Next? You crouch near your meager supplies, squinting to keep dust out of your eyes. Flour, carefully tied up the night before, has burst open. The bag lies on its side like a crime scene, and a fine powder is swirling across the dirt, drifting into the air like ghostly snowflakes. You grab for it, but the wind laughs in your face, pulling little white clouds away. You haven't eaten yet, but the prairie has. Historically, this wasn't far from reality. Settlers' kitchens were constantly under siege by wind, dust, and pests. Try keeping yeast alive when every time you crack a window, it's filled with grit. Letters from frontier wives describe meals that crunched between the teeth, though no nuts were present. That's poetic pioneer code for, we were eating sand sandwiches again. You try a trick you remember reading. Shield the pot with your own body while you strike flint for a fire. The sparks catch, just barely, but the flame that follows is fickle. Every gust turns your little campfire into a candle being blown out at a child's birthday party. After the 4th try, you mutter something unprintable under your breath. The West doesn't care. And here's a quirky detail. Some pioneers claimed the wind itself seasoned their food. A stew left uncovered too long didn't just collect dust. It gained an entire earthy flavor profile. Historians still argue whether this was bravado, necessity, or just a clever way of excusing the fact that everything tasted faintly of clay. You, chewing on a half-burned scrap of bread, vote for excuses. Meanwhile, you try to fry bacon. The fat hisses, sending up a curl of smoke. And whoosh, the smoke's gone before it can rise. In a bizarre way, you're grateful. At least your eyes aren't stinging from it. But your stomach complains that you've burned more calories trying to light the fire than you're about to eat. The comical part? A scrap of bread escapes your hand, lifted like a paper airplane and cartwheeling into the distance. You lunge after it, but the prairie wins. Somewhere, a crow benefits from your clumsy breakfast. Joke number 1 of this section. Congratulations. You've just opened the first prairie fast food delivery service. Unfortunately, it's for the birds. You give up briefly and pour water into a tin cup. The liquid swirls as the wind teases the surface, little ripples forming without your permission. When you lift it to your lips, half the drink sprays back across your cheek. Who needs a shower? Breakfast doubles as skincare out here. Let's not forget the smell. Every burned scrap of food, every bit of smoke that does survive, whips away into your tent, where your bedding soaks it up. Later, when you try to sleep, you'll wonder why your pillow smells like scorched beans. Still, hunger is a stubborn motivator. Eventually, you settle for something simple, jerky. Tough, salty, and nearly indestructible. It's the one thing the wind can't immediately ruin. As your teeth work overtime, you consider how many pioneers must have relied on the same fallback. Historians note jerky was so common that entire trading posts stocked more of it than flour. It kept well, it traveled light, and if you chewed long enough, you could convince yourself it was tender. Then comes joke number 2. You look down at your lap and realize your jerky strip has gathered its own layer of dust, forming what could be the first seasoned beef on the frontier. Some entrepreneur might have bottled it. Prairie Rub TM, now available in Dust Original and Dust with Extra Crunch. The morning trudges on. You've eaten. Sort of. But your body feels cheated. Your belly registers fuel, but your soul demands flavor, warmth, and comfort. And none of those are on the menu today. As you clean up, another thought creeps in. Every calorie counts when survival is uncertain. You recall reading that some homesteads failed not because of storms or raids, but because the sheer effort of keeping food edible drained energy. Farming meant constant exposure to the elements, and cooking meant battling both wind and fuel shortages. Over time, many families simply left. Historians still debate whether wind fatigue played a role in the abandonment of countless small settlements. Joke number 3 comes as you lick your fingers after breakfast, only to discover you've just licked dust. Congratulations, you're now an accidental archaeologist sampling the very soil of the prairie. Tastes like history, you mumble, grimacing, and as you tie up what's left of your supplies, you feel the reality sink in. You're not just fighting hunger here, you're fighting the elements themselves. The wind doesn't simply challenge you, it mocks you, stripping comfort from every bite. Breakfast is supposed to start the day with strength. Instead, you're left with grit between your teeth and the sinking suspicion that you'll need a miracle, or at least a very sturdy lunch, to keep going. Your stomach is grudgingly full, though it feels like you've eaten more sand than sustenance. Still, you push yourself upright and decide to start walking. After all, you've got to get somewhere. Anywhere that doesn't whistle and groan with every gust. Problem is, walking here feels like punishment handed down by Mother Nature herself. You lean into the wind, shoulders hunched, each step heavier than it has any right to be. The ground stretches flat in every direction, a featureless quilt of grasses and dirt. You imagine you're moving forward, but glance back and realize you've barely gained a dozen paces. The sensation is like climbing an invisible escalator that someone cruelly set to down. Frontier journals describe this sensation well. Travel time doubled or tripled when the wind blew against you. Teams of oxen strained and stumbled, their drivers cursing as carts inched along. One settler called it a walk to nowhere, purchased by blister. And you? You're the lucky modern traveler stuck in that exact treadmill of grit. You tug a scarf tighter around your face, though it does little to keep the dust from slipping in. Tiny grains work between your teeth with each breath. It's like chewing gravel while also trying to hydrate with a dry sponge. Joke number 1 writes itself. At least the prairie offers complimentary dental exfoliation. Somewhere in the distance, a tumbleweed rolls by, too fast to chase, too stubborn to ignore. You can't help but envy it. The plant doesn't resist the wind, it embraces it, cartwheeling across the plains with carefree abandon. You, meanwhile, are the human equivalent of an anchor being dragged uphill. Historians still argue whether constant exposure to the wind shaped the very character of frontier life. Some say it bred resilience, others argue it drove families mad. Letters from the Dakotas describe women breaking down in tears after weeks without stillness. Men too confess to exhaustion, calling the wind the endless guest. The debate rages, but you know one thing for sure. The sound of your own grunts and the slap of your boots is not exactly a morale booster. The quirky bit? Some communities actually timed their days by the direction of the wind. Local farmers joked that if the gusts came from the north, you should plant potatoes. From the south, you might as well stay in bed. Entire routines bent around an invisible force that no one could command. Here you are, bending too, like some awkward scarecrow trying not to topple. By now your eyes water constantly. Each blink feels like running sandpaper across your eyelids. You rub them, which only grinds more grit into the corners. Joke number 2. Forget expensive spa treatments. One day here, and your eyelids get a full resurfacing. As you stagger forward, you try to focus on the horizon, but it doesn't really exist. The line where land meets sky blurs, smeared by wind-blown dust. You're reminded of an old painting left out in the rain. You wonder how pioneers navigated this sameness without GPS, or even clear landmarks. Diaries tell us they used distant buttes or the angle of the sun, but on days like this, even those guides dissolved into the haze. At one point, you raise your voice against the gale just to prove you exist. "Hello!" you shout. The sound vanishes instantly, like the wind swallowed it whole. Your own presence feels erased, and it dawns on you. If you collapse here, no one might ever notice. A grim thought, softened only by the realization that even your complaints get recycled into the atmosphere. Still, there's something oddly meditative about the rhythm. Step, lean, breathe. Step, lean, breathe. The monotony numbs your mind. You think of settlers trudging this very soil, boots worn to paper, children dragging behind them. The repetition might have driven some people to despair, but it also created a strange trance, a form of survival. Keep moving. Don't stop. Joke number 3 slips in as your scarf, pulled too tight around your head, flaps open. The wind instantly fills it like a sail, nearly dragging you backward. Congratulations. You've just invented the first prairie paraglider. Sadly, you're the unwilling passenger. Eventually, after what feels like hours, you drop onto a patch of dry grass to catch your breath. Your legs burn, your throat scratches, and your lips sting. You realize with a sinking heart that you've traveled barely a mile. This place doesn't let you arrive anywhere. It just keeps you walking in circles of exhaustion. And yet, through the fatigue, you glimpse what the pioneers must have seen too. An environment that refuses to be tamed, yes, but also one that strips away pretense. Out here, you learn quickly what matters: shelter, water, food, and sheer stubbornness. Comfort is an illusion. Progress is optional. Survival is the only real game in town. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the constant moan of the air. It's like a choir with no conductor, endless and unrelenting. When you open them again, the world hasn't changed. Still wind, still grit, still you, trudging against nothingness. And you finally understand why a single day here could feel like a lifetime. You tell yourself you'll find shelter soon. You have to. Walking against the gale is exhausting, and the thought of some kind of solid walls, any walls, is the only thing pulling you forward. But the windy west is stingy when it comes to comfort. Out here, shelter isn't a house. It's a negotiation with the air itself. The first cabin you stumble across looks sturdy at a distance. Square, low roof, heavy timbers. Perfect, right? But as you get closer, you see the boards quivering like they're about to join a square dance. Every gust rattles the planks, and the roof lifts a fraction before slamming back down. You duck inside anyway, only to find dust has poured through every seam. It's like stepping into a giant flour sack. Historically, many settlers discovered the same thing. Wooden cabins, though simple to build, were terrible at keeping wind out. Gaps between logs acted like whistles. Windows shook until glass cracked. Doors either refused to stay shut or jammed entirely, depending on the wind's mood. One letter from Nebraska in the 1870s describes a family stuffing rags into every crack, only to watch them blow right back out. That's why some families turn to sod houses. Imagine digging into the ground, stacking bricks of prairie earth, and calling it home. Sod houses didn't burn. They stayed cool in summer, and most importantly, the wind couldn't knock them down easily. But here's the quirky catch. Sod walls shed dirt. Every time the wind shifted, tiny clumps flaked off the ceiling, sprinkling the dinner table like unwanted seasoning. Historians still argue whether sod houses were ingenious solutions or just miserable compromises. You, brushing grit off your collar, lean toward miserable. You move on to a tent left behind by some traveler. The canvas is frayed, its ropes half buried in the soil. You duck inside thinking maybe, just maybe, it'll feel calmer. Joke number 1. Within seconds, the entire tent collapses on your head like a giant laundry basket. Congratulations, you've invented pioneer yoga. The first pose is called the prairie pretzel. Frustrated, you crawl free and squint against the wind. You spot another possibility. A dugout built into the side of a hill. That's right. People here literally carved their homes into dirt banks, partly to hide from storms, partly because wood was scarce. You slide down into the entrance, brushing against damp earth walls. It's dark, cramped, and smells faintly of mildew. But for a moment, the wind muffles. You sigh, almost relieved. Almost. Because seconds later, you notice another issue. The dugout is damp. Moisture seeps through the walls, creating sticky mud underfoot. You imagine trying to sleep here with wet socks and buzzing mosquitoes. Joke number 2 forms naturally. Congratulations, you've found the only Airbnb that offers a complimentary mud bath and malaria. You sit on a rock, thinking about how settlers must have juggled these choices. Wood cabins rattled, tents collapsed, sod crumbled, and dugouts dripped. None were perfect. Yet families managed to raise children, cook meals, and even hold church services inside them. Some accounts say people grew oddly fond of their homes, quirks and all. Perhaps survival creates its own brand of affection. Still, you can't help noticing the sound never leaves. Even inside a dugout, the wind hums through cracks like an unwelcome hymn. You lie back against the dirt, listening to the endless vibration. Historians still argue whether the constant noise contributed to what settlers called prairie madness. Some scholars dismiss it as exaggerated frontier gossip, while others note the striking number of diary entries describing headaches, irritability, and sudden tears. Your eyelids flutter just for a second. Maybe you'll nap. But then the wind hits the opening just right, and dirt sprinkles across your face. You cough and sit up. No nap, no peace. Out here, even rest feels like an illusion. Joke number 3 hits as you watch your hat, carefully placed on a nearby rock, lift and twirl out the door. You lunge for it but miss. The hat's gone, off to Kansas or maybe Nebraska. Either way, it's history now. You sigh, realizing you've just made an unintentional donation to the prairie's growing collection of lost fashion accessories. By now, you realize a grim truth. Shelter isn't safety here. It's only a pause, a small illusion of control before the wind reasserts itself. Cabins shake, sod crumbles, tents fold, dugouts drip. The West laughs in your face, daring you to keep trying, and you, brushing dirt from your hair, aren't sure how many more experiments you can endure. 11. Nightfall. Without quiet. You think perhaps the winds will rest with the setting sun, but instead they redouble, whistling through every crack in the walls, turning loose boards into makeshift instruments. Coyotes add their ragged calls, and you remember how diaries describe the strange insomnia of settlers, how the constant battering wore down not only houses, but also nerves. Sleep is a stubborn stranger here, chased off by rattling shutters, flapping canvas, and the ceaseless chorus of moving air. 12. Clothing, like armor. You wrap scarves tightly, layer wool and leather, and even pull socks over your hands. Settlers wrote of dressing not for warmth alone, but for defense against sand that stung like a whip. Strips of cloth tied around faces made neighbors look like bandits, though fashion debates still raged even in frontier misery. Was it better to look proper and endure the grit, or appear ridiculous, but breathe without choking? 13. Writing in the gale. You try scratching notes, but paper flutters and ink spatters. Journals once filled with family news became blotched and wind-torn, sometimes blown entirely away before words were finished. Newspapers, when they could be printed at all, were rare treasures, though even those were sometimes carried off down the prairie, leaving historians to wonder what local wisdom was permanently lost to the sky. 14. Accidents of the wind. A wagon tips, spilling its load, wheels spinning uselessly in midair. Roof shingles peel away like playing cards, barrels roll into ditches, and strange stories circulate. Of chickens whisked up and set down miles away, of hats sailing farther than horses could gallop. Accidents were daily dramas here, and every gust carried the chance of absurd destruction. 15. Dawn again, barely standing. Morning comes without peace, the horizon still veiled in shifting brown. Your clothes hang heavier with dust, your lungs ache, and the ground around you has subtly changed shape overnight. Yet somehow you're still upright, still blinking grit from your eyes, still breathing against the odds. One day on the frontier has stretched into something like a week, and as you watch the new sun struggle through haze, you understand why survival here was never guaranteed. The wind isn't just a force. It carries stories, whether you want them or not. You squint across the plains and almost swear you hear voices in the gusts, soft murmurs, faint laughter, or the whisper of someone calling your name. Your first thought is that your mind is playing tricks. Your second is that you might be slightly insane already. Local folklore loves these tales. Settlers swore the wind carried messages from friends, enemies, or even spirits. Historians still debate whether these whispers were psychological effects of isolation and endless noise, or whether they were real sounds. Voices drifting over miles, distorted and magnified by wind patterns. Either way, your hair is plastered to your face, your scarf does little, and the voices seem to tease you just as much as the dust. Joke number 1 slides in easily. Congratulations, you're now on a ghost call waiting list. No reception needed. Some claim the whispers guided travelers, pointing them toward water or shelter. Others insist the voices were tricks of the prairie, wind making the hollow hollows of the land sound like language. You trudge forward anyway, listening closely, partly for guidance, partly because curiosity is hardwired into your survival instinct. The wind roars over you, shoving your hat into the air again, reminding you that even your attempts to organize thoughts are futile. Quirky tidbit. Some settlers carried small musical instruments, not for entertainment, but to talk back to the wind. A tin whistle, a small drum, or even a handbell supposedly helped communicate presence or mood. Imagine trying to play a flute while dust scours your fingers and hair sticks to the instrument. Historians still argue whether these prairie instruments were practical tools or just hopeful charm objects. The scenery seems alive. Every swirl of dust, every lean of a grass tuft, every far-off shadow hints at a story. A rabbit bolts, ears pressed back, and you almost step on what looks like a trail marker, only to see it's a twisted branch shaped by the wind itself. You pause, listening. The wind carries the faint tinkle of metal, maybe a stray horseshoe or some long-lost trinket. It's hypnotic, the way the sound drifts in and out. Joke number 2. Your scarf has a mind of its own, flapping and twisting as if trying to communicate with the voices. You tug it down, only for it to rise again like a rebellious flag. You chuckle, mostly to yourself, partly in disbelief, and partly because laughter is a small rebellion against relentless gusts. Every step requires awareness. You notice patterns. The wind swirls around depressions, rushes over ridges, and shifts without warning. The prairie seems to breathe and speak at once. Settlers often walked this land with sticks in hand, tapping the ground for subtle cues, sound waves, vibrations, small changes in dust patterns. It was a primitive science, a tactile dance with the elements. By mid-afternoon, your ears ring faintly. You've stopped trying to shout. Your own voice simply evaporates into the noise. The whispers persist, teasing and guiding, frustrating and amusing. Historians still argue whether this auditory phenomenon shaped the folklore and superstition of prairie communities. Either way, you can't deny the effect. You're paying attention, even if it's just to convince yourself you're not entirely alone. Joke number 3 arrives as a small tumbleweed rolls by, seemingly nodding at you before the wind snatches it away. You imagine it whispering secrets in its own plant language. You nod back. Survival here, you realize, is as much about imagination as it is about grit, food, or shelter. For now you trudge on, listening to the wind-borne whispers, brushing dust from your eyes, and silently wondering what the next gust will carry toward you. It's relentless, oddly musical, and strangely mesmerizing. You can't survive a day here without respecting its strange, invisible narrative. By now, grit is everywhere. Your hair, your teeth, your eyes, and even that one sock you didn't think could possibly hold any more dust. You wipe your face, but it only smears it around. Every crevice seems to harbor its own tiny prairie ecosystem, a microcosm of the relentless wind's handiwork. You start to understand why settlers developed so many unusual remedies for discomfort. One fringe solution involves swallowing small amounts of animal fat, or rubbing it around the eyes to keep dust from scratching corneas. You try not to gag at the thought. Historians still argue whether these treatments genuinely helped or were placebo magic to keep spirits up. Either way, they read like instructions for surviving in some bizarre prehistoric spa. You tuck your face into your scarf and wonder if spit might be the 21st century equivalent. You spit anyway, carefully into the dirt. The grainy mixture leaves an odd taste, a blend of dust, water, and regret. Joke number 1 forms. Congratulations, your mouth just got a full prairie exfoliation treatment. No appointment needed. You chew the gritty remnants of yesterday's jerky while brushing the worst out of your teeth, realizing that dental hygiene in this wind is both futile and deeply philosophical. Even your eyelashes hold tiny specks of debris, making every blink a gritty microscrub. You remember reading that settlers often had to clean their eyes multiple times a day, sometimes using water drawn from nearby streams, sometimes relying on cloths that were themselves coated in dirt. Imagination aside, it sounds exhausting, and it is. Hair presents its own challenge. Every strand is a rebellious individual, waving at the wind like it's auditioning for its own prairie ballet. You try to tuck it under a scarf, only for it to escape in dramatic fashion. Historians still argue whether frontier hair fashions were truly functional or simply a quirky aesthetic attempt to tame the chaos. You sigh, thinking that no fashion statement is worth this level of struggle. By mid-morning, your lips are cracked and sandy. You reach for a small balm, only to discover that the tin has collected dust inside, forming a paste with all the moisture removed. You smear it on anyway, just for the sensation. Joke number 2. Congratulations, you've just invented prairie clay lip gloss, trendy if slightly abrasive. You look down at your hands, noticing the thick layer of dust and dry skin. Some settlers reportedly wore gloves constantly, even in summer, just to avoid wind-induced abrasion. Others stitched strips of cloth over knuckles, creating makeshift armor for their extremities. You imitate the method with the socks from your boots, tying them in crude loops over your fingers. It's not effective, but it feels momentarily defiant. Every sensory detail reminds you that survival here is relentless. You taste sand with every swallow, hear wind in every pause, and see grit in every reflective surface. Yet you trudge on, brushing away the worst, making small adjustments, and acknowledging the pioneer truth. Discomfort is constant, and adaptation is mandatory. Joke number 3 comes as a particularly strong gust flips your scarf over your eyes, leaving you momentarily blind and tangled. You stumble like a newborn fawn, cursing softly to no one, and laugh at the absurdity. If this is survival, you decide, it's as much about humor as it is about hygiene or grit. By the time you catch your breath, you realize the wind has worked its way inside your ears, teeth, and even your thoughts. You pause, thinking of strange remedies again, and wonder how anyone managed a full day without at least imagining invisible armor, or whispering to themselves as if the wind could understand. The prairie, relentless as ever, continues its subtle lesson. Every particle matters, every movement counts, and nothing, no hair, no scarf, no thought, is safe from the invisible, omnipresent push of the West. You stumble across a small herd of horses grazing cautiously in the distance. At first you imagine they're calm, but a gust lifts the dry grass like a wave, and suddenly the animals bolt, nostrils flaring, hooves striking the earth with hollow thumps. You freeze, unsure whether to run or stay, realizing how quickly even the most mundane landscape can become chaotic. Frontier ranchers face this every day. Horses, cattle, and other livestock would panic in strong winds, often bolting into fences, ditches, or one another. Entire herds could scatter in moments, and farmers sometimes spent hours, even days, trying to round them up. You, observing the scene, begin to appreciate the sheer patience required to manage animals in this environment. Historians still argue whether certain breeds were preferred for their calm temperament or sheer stubbornness. They were, after all, more likely to survive gusts like this. You inch closer, noticing tufts of fur and flattened grass marking the animals' paths. Each gust shapes the landscape and the herd alike. One horse, a chestnut with a white blaze on its forehead, shakes its mane violently, sending dust spraying in every direction. Joke number 1 comes to mind. Congratulations, you've just been hit by a horsetail snowstorm. Welcome to prairie weather. Settlers sometimes used simple tricks to keep animals calmer, moving slowly, creating windbreaks with wagons or fences, or even laying down blankets to shield the herd. The ingenuity required often bordered on artistry. You squint at a treeless horizon and realize there's nothing here for comfort. No shields, no walls, no gentle ditches. Everything relies on you, your wits, and the grace of the wind. A quirky detail emerges. Some ranchers claimed that talking to horses during a gale actually helped keep them grounded. Whispering repetitive words, humming, even singing softly could distract the animals long enough to guide them through turbulent weather. You attempt it, muttering softly to the chestnut horse. It snorts and shakes its head. Historians still debate whether this technique was practical advice or frontier folklore, but you're willing to try anything. You notice the wind shaping not only the animals, but the land itself. Sand accumulates in small dunes, depressions become minor obstacles, and the horses adjust instinctively. You realize your every step, your every movement, is also subject to these subtle changes. The terrain isn't just flat, it's a living, shifting challenge. Joke number 2 hits when one particularly bold horse trots close enough that a gust kicks up a cloud of dust, coating your boots in a fine layer of animal-scented grit. You cough, swat at the dust, and wonder whether survival is about endurance or the ability to ignore minor indignities. Either way, the chestnut horse seems to regard you with suspicion, as if you're the stranger in its personal windstorm narrative. You continue moving alongside the herd at a careful distance. Every gust pushes you sideways. Every hoofbeat echoes against the empty plains, and your balance feels perpetually precarious. Even the simplest act of walking becomes a negotiation between your body, the animals, and the wind itself. Joke number 3 arises when a particularly strong gust flips your coat collar over your head, and you stumble, waving your arms like a windmill. The chestnut horse pauses, snorts, and trots away, clearly unimpressed by your improvisational dance. You laugh to yourself, recognizing the absurdity, even as fatigue tugs at every muscle. By the time the herd disappears over a distant rise, you're left reflecting on what you've witnessed. The wind doesn't just shape the land, it dictates behavior, mood, and survival. Ranching here wasn't merely work. It was constant adaptation, an ongoing conversation between humans, animals, and an indifferent sky. You take a deep breath, tasting grit again, and realize that even a short walk with livestock is exhausting beyond measure. And that's only day 1. You pause, realizing that a campfire would be a luxury here, an impossible one, really. The wind doesn't simply tease flames, it eats them whole. Sparks leap from your carefully arranged twigs, only to vanish instantly, carried into the endless brown haze. You poke at the fire, whispering coaxing words like a desert shaman, but the elements remain unsympathetic. You're reminded why pioneers often cooked over improvised windbreaks, burying fires partially in soil or surrounding them with stones to shield the heat. Historians still argue whether these methods were standard practice or sporadic ingenuity born of desperation. You sit down on a flat rock, gripping a small tin pan, and staring at the few scraps of food you've managed to protect from the wind. Your breath fogs in the chill, dust settling into the corners of your mouth. You chew quietly, realizing that even the act of eating feels like a negotiation with nature. Joke number 1 sneaks in. Bon appétit. The Michelin-starred Wind Chef is serving everything a la prairie grit. Oddly enough, some pioneers improvised by using pots buried to half their depth in the soil, the earth itself shielding flames from gusts. You attempt the same, covering a few twigs with dirt. Sparks flare briefly, teasing you with warmth and hope. But the wind finds every opening. The fire hisses and collapses into smoke before it can fully ignite. You're reminded of diary entries describing meals that could only be eaten once, and sometimes only imagined. The quirky side? One frontier trick was to fashion a little clay oven from mud, shaping a mound over a pan to trap heat. Sounds promising, right? But the clay dries too fast in wind or crumbles unexpectedly, and you end up with more dust than dinner. You try to laugh, realizing joke number 2. Congratulations, you've invented prairie pottery. You just can't eat it. As you shove a few twigs together for another attempt, you notice something remarkable. Even small flames can create hypnotic patterns in the dust. The wind carries sparks like tiny fireflies, swirling them around you, almost choreographed. Settlers sometimes wrote about this as a prairie light show, a fleeting beauty in an otherwise harsh environment. You can't help but be a little awed, even while your stomach protests. Time passes slowly. The sun shifts, the wind continues its relentless choreography, and your attempts to cook slowly give way to fatigue. You chew the jerky you've brought, sipping water and imagining what a real, steady fire would feel like. Historians still debate whether constant exposure to these conditions contributed to the innovative cooking methods we see today in frontier recipes, or whether it simply drove cooks mad. You feel momentarily it might be a little of both. Joke number 3. A particularly strong gust flips your tin pan like a frisbee, sending it tumbling across the rocks. You sprint after it, only to watch it vanish into a dust cloud. You mutter a cheerless victory for the prairie, realizing it's winning every round. Eventually you lean back, tasting the faintly burnt dust in your mouth, listening to the wind's steady roar, and accept a humble truth. A fire here is never truly yours. It exists in fleeting moments, ephemeral and taunting, a lesson in patience, ingenuity, and humility. You sip your water again, hoping that even small acts of warmth are enough to keep you moving forward. The wind becomes your gentle, abrasive teacher as you imagine the peculiar punishments settlers joked about or endured while living here. Sand scoured skin like nature's lash, and even the smallest chores turned into exercises in humility. One diary entry describes washing windows with tears and grit, and you have to admit that sounds about right. The West doesn't bother with subtlety. It insists on participation, whether you like it or not. You attempt to stretch, flex your aching muscles, and maybe feel some relief. But the wind hurls dust into every joint, every crease of your clothing, and your socks are already stiff with soil. Joke number 1 slides in effortlessly. Frontier yoga. No instructors, no mats, just endless prairie exfoliation. Historical accounts confirm that settlers often treated wind and sand almost as a judicial force. Punishments were sometimes humorous in tone, forcing a mischievous boy to sweep the yard while gusts carried the dust back in his face. But they were real, and they built resilience. Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerated for letters back east, or actually routine methods of maintaining order. You, brushing grit from your hands, lean toward somewhere in the middle. Odd remedies existed for wind-induced discomfort. Settlers rubbed animal fats, concocted herbal pastes, or wrapped cloth around their hands and faces like primitive armor. Some claimed that placing a small weight on the scalp could prevent hair from standing on end in a gale, though no one can agree whether it actually worked. You tug at your scarf, realizing your own hair is staging a full revolt. You move on, noting the peculiar sensation of skin rubbing against gritty clothing. It's not painful exactly, but it's relentless. You remember a humorous anecdote about a homestead family who gave up trying to sweep their porch, instead letting wind carry dust into neat, random piles, a kind of natural cleaning service. Joke number 2 comes naturally. Congratulations, the wind just invented autonomous landscaping. You're welcome. You stumble over uneven ground, each gust threatening to topple you as you trudge toward the next patch of relative safety. Even minor tasks, tying ropes, checking supplies, adjusting a hat, become exercises in coordination and patience. Frontier children were said to spend days learning to walk and work with the wind, absorbing lessons in balance that no indoor playroom could provide. The quirky observation, some settlers built wind bells, not just to warn of storms, but to entertain themselves while waiting. Simple metal chimes on poles would jingle and spin, turning annoyance into small amusement. You pause, imagining the sound above the roar of your personal gale, a fleeting note of whimsy. Historians still debate whether these devices were practical or purely for morale. As the sun dips, casting long shadows, you pause again. The wind scratches your skin, lifts your hair, rattles your gear, and whispers its judgment. You laugh softly at the absurdity. Here, every chore, every step, every gust is a tiny punishment and a lesson. And yet, survival depends on embracing it, even if only with humor, ingenuity, and stubborn persistence. Joke number 3 sneaks in as your boot slips on a small mound of dust, sending you sprawling briefly before the wind pulls you upright again. You grin, realizing that even a stumble is both punishment and entertainment, courtesy of the relentless West. As you trudge onward, your mind drifts to the echoes of commerce that once ran through this windy expanse. Imagine small wagons, carefully packed with goods, struggling against gusts that seemed determined to delay or destroy every shipment. Traders relied on the wind as much as they feared it, and their journals describe items drifting off the backs of carts, rolling into the plains as if the prairie itself was claiming a toll. Historians still argue whether trade across the wind-beaten regions was truly sustainable or if it merely looked organized on paper. Letters mention merchants calculating losses with precise notes on which goods survived and which were claimed by the gusts. You peer at your own scattered supplies and nod. Those losses suddenly feel very personal. Oddly, the wind also became a medium for communication. Notes tied to sticks or weighted with small stones were sometimes sent across small distances, relying on precise gusts. The quirky side of commerce emerges. Some traders would guess the wind's path, predicting where their parcels might land. You imagine a letter carried by wind, delivering both your morning musings and prairie dust simultaneously. Joke number 1 surfaces. Congratulations! Your mail is now express delivered by a very unreliable air courier. The terrain itself participates in this strange economy. Dust settles differently depending on ridges, hollows, or tufts of prairie grass, subtly guiding or obstructing the flow of goods. Traders adapted, building slight barriers and creative carts designed to hold weight and resist the invisible tug of gusts. You take a moment to inspect a low mound, imagining it once served as a mini windbreak for a cartload of delicate items. You notice some small items, bits of metal, pottery shards, and faded fabric, twisting and rolling across the soil. The prairie has its own way of redistributing commerce, recycling remnants over time. It's almost poetic, this constant movement. Historians still debate whether these patterns inadvertently shaped local trading practices or simply created chaos that settlers endured with gritted teeth. Joke number 2 arises as you spot a tin cup tumbling gracefully across a rise, pirouetting in the wind like a figure skater. You sprint after it, realizing the wind has turned everyday objects into instruments of both frustration and entertainment. You nearly catch it, only for a gust to flip it again. The cup's acrobatics are somehow more graceful than your own clumsy dance against the wind. You continue walking, noticing distant signs of human effort, a flattened path, a buried fence post, or the corner of a sod wall peeking from the horizon. Even in the face of relentless wind, people built networks of movement, commerce, and survival. The prairie doesn't just punish, it also provides a framework for ingenuity. Joke number 3 hits as a small tumbleweed carries a torn piece of cloth past you, resembling a banner claiming victory in the endless battle between humans and the gusts. You laugh softly, acknowledging that commerce here wasn't just about profit. It was about persistence, improvisation, and occasionally ridiculous spectacle. By the time the sun dips lower, painting the horizon with gold and brown, you realize that the West has its own economy, one of dust, wind, and ingenuity. Every object, every gust, every misplaced item tells a story, a constant reminder that surviving here meant understanding patterns, improvising constantly, and laughing at the absurdity of it all. Night falls, though here, night is merely a dimming of the endless swirl of dust and wind. You had hoped the sun's retreat might calm the gusts, give you a chance to rest, but the West doesn't negotiate on your timetable. The wind redoubles its efforts, rattling boards, flapping canvas, and whispering across the barren landscape. You realize that sleep is not a guaranteed commodity here. It is a luxury earned through patience, grit, and a little bit of luck. Settlers' diaries mention nights of near constant wakefulness, not from fear or hunger, but from the relentless soundscape. Even in cabins, tents, or dugouts, the wind's voice persisted, sometimes lulling, often maddening. Historians still argue whether prairie insomnia was primarily a physical response to noise or a psychological toll exacted by isolation and perpetual motion. Either way, you are starting to understand the phenomenon firsthand. You huddle in a small shelter, the closest approximation to safety you've found, brushing dust from your face and clothes. Every item around you rattles and shifts, and even the faintest opening seems like a drumline for the storm outside. Joke number 1 sneaks in. Congratulations, you've just enrolled in a one-night-only percussion concert. Tickets sold separately, earplugs not included. Quirky frontier detail. Settlers often created wind chimes or small noise-making devices not just for decoration, but to gauge wind speed and direction. The jingle of a metal cup, the clang of a tin lid, or even a string of small bells could indicate an impending gust. You listen, half awed, half annoyed, as the wind produces its own symphony, each note unpredictable and endless. Your stomach grumbles quietly. Even though you've eaten, the combination of dust, wind, and exertion leaves you craving more substance. You reach for jerky and water, but the ritual is complicated. Every sip and bite carries sand, and swallowing feels like negotiating with the West itself. Joke number 2 emerges. Congratulations, your meal is now a full sensory adventure, grit included at no extra charge. You try to lie down, wrapping your scarf tightly around your head. Even this minor attempt at comfort is under siege. The shelter's walls groan under the pressure of the wind, and small gaps let in sharp needles of grit that sting exposed skin. Frontier families describe similar scenarios. No place was ever completely safe from the elements, and sleep became a series of micro-naps, punctuated by waking to brace against gusts. Joke number 3 arises as a scrap of cloth flutters down the shelter like a ghost, landing on your face. You slap it away, muttering a grin of reluctant amusement. Even in discomfort, humor becomes survival. You realize that nights in the West are less about rest and more about endurance, patience, and learning to find tiny moments of absurdity in the chaos. As the hours stretch, you let your eyes drift closed. The wind's constant moan fades into the background, almost like white noise. You imagine generations of pioneers bracing against the same gusts, whispering to themselves, humming songs, or making notes in journals about what the day taught them. It's a strange comfort, knowing that others endured, improvised, and sometimes laughed in the same way you are. Even now, as you lie there, half sleeping, half listening, the prairie continues its endless lesson. Survival requires vigilance, flexibility, and a sense of humor. The night is long, the wind unrelenting, but somehow you endure. Morning arrives with a muted glow, filtered through the ever-present haze of dust. You open your eyes, feeling every joint stiff, every muscle sore, and every fiber of clothing weighed down by grit. The wind hasn't relented overnight. If anything, it seems more insistent, as if testing your resolve. You stretch carefully, knowing that even small movements require negotiation with the elements. Settlers often described mornings like this as a battle before breakfast, where the simple act of rising from bed or dugout floor demanded patience and ingenuity. Historians still debate whether chronic exposure to relentless wind influenced not only physical endurance, but also the cultural temperament of frontier communities. You lean into the wind, pulling your scarf tighter, realizing firsthand why perseverance was prized above all else. Quirky frontier detail. In some communities, people tied small bells to clothing or gear so that they could locate family members when gusts obscured sight. The sound of jingling metal would cut through the drone of wind, creating a faint, reassuring melody. You tug at your scarf, imagining a chorus of bells accompanying your slow march forward. Joke number 1 slides naturally. Congratulations. You're now a one-person wind orchestra, solo performances all day long. You check your meager supplies, noting that yesterday's jerky is now even dustier, the water slightly cloudy. Cooking will be another challenge. Any flame you try will be immediately claimed by gusts. You sip water cautiously, tasting the faint tang of soil, and marvel at how settlers endured this, improvising meals, rationing and laughing at absurdities that would crush city dwellers. Even clothing becomes a lesson in adaptation. Layers of wool, leather, and cloth act as armor against the wind, though each gust threatens to tangle, flap, or dislodge your efforts. Settlers sometimes improvised, tying extra strips of fabric around wrists, ankles, and even hats, creating a patchwork of protection that resembled makeshift uniforms. Historians still argue whether such methods were practical or largely symbolic, intended to boost morale as much as preserve warmth. Joke number 2 arrives when a particularly strong gust flips your coat collar over your head, leaving you momentarily blind and disoriented. You stumble forward, waving your arms like a windmill, and can't help laughing at the ridiculous choreography of survival. The prairie, indifferent, seems to enjoy your performance. You begin moving toward a distant ridge, hoping for slightly calmer conditions. The landscape is deceptive. Ridges can channel wind, intensifying gusts unexpectedly. You remember diaries describing mirage-like havens where the wind appeared gentler, only to strike again without warning. Scholars still debate whether early settlers exaggerated these experiences or accurately chronicled the subtle but constant shifts in wind behavior. By mid-morning, your face is streaked with dust and sweat. Each inhale carries a taste of the prairie itself, earth, grit, and dry vegetation. You pause to breathe, noticing how the wind interacts with every surface. Grasses bow, small stones roll, and the air seems alive, almost sentient. Your eyes water, your lips crack, and yet you continue. Joke number 3 surfaces as you spot a small tumbleweed rolling past, perfectly timed to pass between your feet like a referee in an invisible sport. You mutter congratulations under your breath, acknowledging that humor, like grit, is essential to enduring the wind's relentless lessons. Even as fatigue tugs at your body, you realize that surviving here demands constant engagement. Every step, every breath, every minor adjustment is part of a larger negotiation. The West does not allow slacking. It rewards attention, patience, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a sense of humor. By midday, you realize your senses have been recalibrated entirely to the wind. Your hearing picks up subtle changes in gust patterns. Your vision anticipates dust swirls. Your skin feels every nuance of movement in the air. You can almost read the prairie, though it offers no comfort, only guidance and occasional trickery. Settlers described similar experiences, claiming that after months or years, you could predict the wind's whims with remarkable accuracy. Some could estimate speed by watching grass tips or detect subtle shifts that foreshadowed stronger gusts. Historians still argue whether these abilities were innate or learned. Survival demanded both observation and intuition. Either way, you begin to feel a strange kinship with those long-ago observers. You pause near a small depression in the land, a natural windbreak, and crouch for a brief respite. Joke number 1 emerges as you realize the relief is momentary. A sudden gust lifts a small stone and sends it rolling towards your boot. You barely dodge it, muttering, "Ah, yes, front row seating for the prairie's rock ballet." Odd frontier details keep surprising you. Some pioneers carried small flags or ribbons to mark paths in open terrain, helping them avoid retracing steps in featureless landscapes. You consider this tactic but lack the tools, and besides, the wind would likely claim your markers as easily as it claimed your hat yesterday. You admire the ingenuity, tiny acts of control against a largely uncontrollable force. You notice the air feels drier, harsher, as if every breath pulls moisture from your lungs. Your throat is scratchy, your skin tight, and your muscles protest. Settlers relied on wells, streams, or rain catchment systems, but even then, water carried dust and grit. Historians still debate whether chronic dehydration contributed to the tales of prairie madness, or if it was more psychological, amplified by isolation and relentless noise. Joke number 2 slides in as a small gust lifts your empty water bottle and spins it like a top. You chase it half-heartedly, laughing at your own futility. "Congratulations, your hydration system is now self-propelled," you mutter. Humor, you realize, is essential survival gear. You start walking again, scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks. But the landscape seems endlessly flat, undifferentiated, except for the occasional mound or lone tree. You recall that settlers sometimes relied on distant buttes, rivers, or even unusual rock formations to navigate. Though on days like this, these guides might as well have been mirages. Your ears pick up faint creaking sounds, probably a weathered fence or a long-abandoned cabin. You move cautiously, curiosity overcoming fatigue. You discover the remnants of a small settlement, a collapsed cabin wall, rusted tools half buried in dust, and faintly charred timbers hinting at an old hearth. Joke number 3. Frontier Airbnb. Stay at your own risk, complimentary dust included. As you sift through the ruins, you feel a connection to those who endured before you. Their trials, small triumphs, and constant negotiation with the wind echo in every tilted post and scattered nail. You're not alone in this landscape. Centuries of effort, patience, and occasional absurdity linger like ghosts riding the gusts. By mid-afternoon, you straighten up, brushing dust from your hands, and prepare to move onward. The West has taught you lessons in endurance, humor, and adaptation, and even a single day leaves marks on body and mind. Survival is less about conquering this place than about learning its rhythms, bending with its gusts, and occasionally laughing at its audacious, invisible tricks. Late afternoon arrives, and the light takes on a golden hue, filtering through the constant haze of dust and grit. The wind hasn't slowed. In fact, it seems to gain strength as if mocking the sun's attempt at calm. You notice subtle changes, eddies forming in depressions, dust spinning into delicate tornadoes, and grass bending like synchronized dancers. Every step requires concentration. Every movement negotiates with an invisible force that doesn't understand your tired limbs. Settlers often describe these late afternoons as moments when the prairie's personality became most evident. Historians still argue whether the heightened wind was seasonal or simply perceptual. After hours of exposure, the gusts felt stronger, more insistent, and almost purposeful. Either way, your joints ache, your lungs protest, and yet you trudge forward, learning once again that the West doesn't pause for comfort. Quirky frontier fact. Some homesteaders tied small strips of colored cloth to fence posts, not just for navigation, but to study wind patterns visually. Watching ribbons twist and whirl became a form of informal meteorology, a scientific curiosity interwoven with survival. You pause, imagining yourself as both scientist and unwilling participant in a perpetual experiment. Joke number 1 arises naturally. Congratulations, you've just invented prairie ribbon aerodynamics. Results inconclusive. You pause beside a shallow ditch, the nearest semblance of shelter. The wind swirls through it, but it provides a momentary buffer. Settlers often built temporary windbreaks with stacked stones or earth mounds. Even small measures helped, though the wind always found gaps, reminding inhabitants that control was only an illusion. Historians still debate whether these strategies truly protected people or simply offered psychological comfort. Joke number 2 emerges as you crouch, only to have your scarf flap over your eyes. You stumble slightly, arms flailing, and mutter to yourself, "Frontier blindfold training, perfect for the Wind Olympics." The prairie, indifferent, continues its relentless lesson. Your stomach grumbles, reminding you that energy is fleeting and food scarce. You nibble jerky and sip water, both seasoned generously with dust. Settlers managed similar situations, often rationing supplies meticulously, using ingenuity to stretch every bite. Some even created small wind-protected nooks for cooking, though results were inconsistent. You admire the resourcefulness. As the wind howls, you notice distant shapes, perhaps a hill, a lone tree, or the faint outline of a creek. You move cautiously, every gust threatening balance. Objects are shifted subtly by the air. Small stones, twigs, and tufts of grass rearranged in ways that make landmarks unreliable. Settlers had to memorize terrain meticulously, learning which features were permanent and which were ephemeral, shaped constantly by the invisible force around them. Joke number 3. A small tumbleweed rolls between your legs, almost like it's mocking your progress. You leap aside, laughing softly at the absurdity. Even in exhaustion, the wind's whimsical choreography teaches patience and humor. By evening, you recognize the pattern. The prairie does not yield. It shapes movement, behavior, and thought, demanding endurance and creativity. You trudge onward, respecting its lessons, appreciating its quirks, and laughing quietly at its endless, invisible games. The West may be indifferent, but surviving it requires engagement, observation, and occasionally, absurdity. Night falls again, though the dimming light seems little different from the haze that has accompanied you all day. The wind continues its relentless performance, a constant reminder that rest is earned, not given. You pull your scarf tighter, hug your coat closer, and trudge toward a low ridge that offers the slightest promise of shelter. Your body aches, your lungs burn faintly with dust, and your feet feel heavier with every step. Settlers described nights like these as tests of both stamina and wit. Historians still debate whether the so-called prairie madness was primarily physiological, resulting from constant exposure to wind, dust, and exhaustion, or psychological, a product of isolation and endless monotony. Either way, the night feels long, and sleep seems like a distant memory. You find a small depression, a natural hollow in the land, and squat low to minimize exposure. Joke number 1 creeps in. Congratulations, you've just discovered the world's least luxurious hotel. Prairie Edition. No room service. Complimentary dust. The wind still finds its way through every gap, tugging at your clothing, whipping hair across your face, and pushing dirt into eyes, ears, and mouth. Odd frontier details surface in your memory. Some settlers fashioned makeshift windbreaks from overturned crates, brush, or even stacked clothing. The ingenuity required to create small havens was extraordinary. A pile of blankets, rocks, or twigs could become a temporary sanctuary from gusts, though nothing was ever fully secure. Historians still debate how effective these interventions truly were, but the effort itself was essential. You hunch down, closing your eyes briefly, letting the wind's constant roar become a lullaby of sorts. Joke number 2. A small gust lifts your hat, spinning it across the hollow like a frisbee. You lunge, miss, and mutter, "Congratulations, your hat is now a professional stunt performer." Even in discomfort, you notice humor keeps the mind light and alert. Your mind drifts to stories of settlers who whispered songs, hums, or prayers into the wind, hoping their voices would carry comfort or companionship. You try softly humming yourself, feeling the vibration through your chest. The wind absorbs it, distorts it, and returns it as a faint, comforting echo. Oddly, you find a measure of solace in this, a reminder that even the harshest environment has a rhythm that can be joined rather than resisted. Joke number 3 arises as you swat at a tumbleweed that brushes against your leg, momentarily startling you. You laugh quietly, realizing that in this relentless environment, Even minor absurdities become moments of joy, keeping you grounded in a strange, chaotic world. By the time the horizon begins to hint at dawn, you are exhausted, covered in dust, and acutely aware of how little control you have over this landscape. And yet, you are still upright, still breathing, still moving forward. Survival here is less about conquering the wind and more about negotiation, learning its rhythms, anticipating its moods, and finding fleeting humor in every challenge. The West has taught its lessons: endurance, observation, ingenuity, and the importance of laughter. You've walked a day that would have overwhelmed anyone unprepared for its subtle cruelty and whimsical tricks. And as you brace for another night, you realize that surviving even a single day here requires respect, attention, and a willingness to adapt, while never losing the ability to smile at the absurdity of it all. Now, let your body sink gently into the surface beneath you. Feel the weight of your limbs release, the muscles uncoil, and the lungs soften their rhythm. The wind continues its distant whisper, but it is no longer a threat. It is a soft hum, a companion to your thoughts. Imagine each gust as a gentle brush, a lullaby composed by the endless prairie, brushing away tension and the grit of the day. Breathe slowly, noticing the dust and soil fading from mind and memory, leaving only a quiet appreciation for endurance, patience, and subtle wonder. You can almost picture the faint outlines of hills and grasses bending together in harmony, the land itself exhaling alongside you. Every sensation becomes softer: the whisper of air against skin, the distant call of an unseen bird, the gentle rhythm of your own heartbeat. Reflect for a moment on the pioneers who came before, moving through similar gusts, negotiating with invisible forces, finding humor where they could, and learning to exist in the perpetual motion of the West. Their ingenuity and resilience ripple through time, reminding you that even the most relentless environments can teach grace, patience, and perspective. Let your thoughts drift, imagining the wind carrying away worries, fears, and fatigue. Picture the horizon slowly lightening as dawn approaches, the prairie holding its breath, quiet for just a moment. Feel yourself part of this vast landscape, connected to its rhythms, its lessons, and its gentle, unending motion. Softly, allow your mind to ease into rest. The wind's voice, once relentless, becomes a steady companion to your slowing thoughts, a quiet whisper guiding you into calm, into stillness, into sleep. Tonight you've survived the day, and tomorrow, whether in dreams or in gentle imagination, you will continue to move with the wind,